viruses. Are they even alive? Where do they fit in all of the phylogenomics we've been exploring thus far? That is the topic of interest in this video. And scientists have been reluctant to give classification of living to viruses. They do not want to ascribe that status to them because they don't satisfy all the conditions other life, specifically cells, satisfy. Now, I'd like to draw on an analogy, if I may, that involves Pluto. Now, astrophysicists and domain experts are unwilling to classify or give the label of planet to Pluto. That's because Pluto doesn't satisfy all the conditions. They satisfy, let's say, 2 of the 3 major ones. Number 1, it orbits a star, in this case, the sun. So that's number 1. That's good. It does that. It is large enough or massive enough that it's got a approximately spherical or round shape due to gravitation. So that's good. We've seen pictures. But it doesn't have the ability to dominate gravitationally in its local region of space. And that's because it's part of the Kuiper belt, which has comparable objects to Pluto that compete with Pluto for gravitational dominance. Other planets don't have to do that. They are the dominant gravitational source in their local region. So Pluto is described as a dwarf planet. Now, planet's still in the name, but that's not the point. The point is, viruses similarly only satisfy 2 of the 3 major conditions, which you can want to explore more. I did an episode, the first episode of this series, on what is life, and I break down and go on a deep dive of the definition of life and the working definition of life, and that's what we'll be using here. So first off, viruses are a chemical system, so that's good. They are undergoing Darwinian evolution. That's good. That's 2. But they do not have the capacity to self-sustain. Now, I'd like to go into this a little further. They are a chemical system because once they hijack a cell, they undergo various different chemical reactions to transfer energy, which does work. And that work is for a purpose. And that purpose is for the virus to replicate and pass on its genome to a new viral particle that will then eventually infect another cell, and so on and so forth. And these are done through enzymes and other complexes that facilitate for this energy transfer, such as RNA polymerase or transcriptase or but other enzymes, and including ribosomes for translation. And all of this is in an effort to replicate. In addition, not all viruses successfully hijack a cell, take control of the transcription process or the ribosomes for them to translate their genome into new proteins that will create the capsid, which is like the head of the virus, or create the sheath of the legs, or other proteins that will allow for the virus body to be created. They die out. Their genome is no longer propagated to future generations. Their lineage is done. And so mutations take place. Certain genomes are selected for those that are more likely to survive or have the capacity to survive. Their genes get passed on. And so those viruses will live on. That is Darwinian evolution. But viruses are enzymatically inert. They have no metabolism. They have no ribosomes of their own. They don't have any of the features or structures that allow them to self-replicate or survive on their own. They are completely inert until they reach a cell and are able to infect that cell. So in some ways, you could think of a virus as living in the proper context, in the proper environment. For example, if I was shot up into space without a spacesuit or a spaceship or some other artificial environment to protect my metabolism, I would also not be living. But on Earth, I am the definition of life. You, me, all animals are living. But we wouldn't be living in space. Now you can think of where the virus is when it's not in a cell, it's in space. And so it has the extra property of being able to protect itself while in space until it reaches its environment. It has a spacesuit in a way. That is the capsid head, or the proteins, or the sheath that protects its body, that protects its genome from the environment until it reaches where it needs to go. Similarly to me. And so for this reason, and also an additional reason would be, we've actually have some evidence from giant viruses that they may have at some point in biological history had the capacity to self-replicate. They have remnants of ribosomes and other translation machinery and other features that allow for translation to take place, so self-replication to take place, and to the ability to synthesize proteins or be at least metabolically active. So that's groundbreaking in a way. The evidence isn't foolproof. We're just finding these things. But it is an interesting thought. Now, viruses almost certainly predate LUCA, which was the topic of the last video. And that is because LUCA had a CRISPR immune system that fought off viruses. It wouldn't have had this immune system if viruses came after LUCA, or, just simultaneously is just too coincidental to be true. So they had to have predated LUCA. Now, it doesn't mean that viruses predated cells necessarily, just that they predated LUCA, given LUCA's immune system. So in my opinion, and I'm not the expert, and this is hotly debated, there are two empires of life on Earth. There are viruses, and then there are cells. These are the two domains, the two empires of life on Earth. And I'd like to finish the video with a 3D animation I created for the CRISPR immune system that was unique to LUCA. Now, this is a nascent or primitive form of CRISPR immune systems, and it's not much like what we have today. It has, bits and pieces of what an advanced and evolved CRISPR immune system that exists today. And so why don't we jump into that? LUCA is not alone. Here is a virus. It is a phage with its DNA encased in a protein coat called a capsid. Its body is a tube wrapped in sheath with spikes for legs to attach itself to a host. The virus is barreling toward LUCA, and it just caught its target. The virus has latched itself onto LUCA and is now infecting them by injecting its genome into the cell. The virus hopes, and I use the word hope a bit loosely here, that its genetic material will encounter an RNA polymerase while in the cytoplasm. So this way, the cell will transcribe its genetic sequence, where it can then hijack the ribosome for translation, and out comes proteins that will build a new virus body, and thus the virus will have successfully replicated. Instead, the virus bumps into a cascade complex containing Cas3, which is how the viral genome will be degraded and destroyed. The cell's CRISPR immune system, a form of adaptive immunity, is located on its circular chromosome and has genes coding for the Cas proteins that will defend against repeat offenders like this virus. Unique to LUCA, Cas1 and Cas2 are seemingly absent according to researchers. So it's a bit of a mystery how LUCA is acquiring the invader sequences for future identification, like fingerprints or mugshots, because that is typically the role of Cas1 and 2. Regardless, LUCA has the spacers from previous invaders and is immunized against any virus with those same spacers that attempt to hijack the cell. The cascade complex then roams until it is able to target and bind the viral DNA by matching its sequence. Once binded, Cas3 degrades the target, chopping them up into little fragments so they can no longer be transcribed. This CRISPR system is not nearly as advanced as many modern-day CRISPRs, where they can simply splice the strand at one spot in methodical fashion using Cas9. Cas9 also seems to be absent in LUCA, so Cas3 more barbarically degrades the entire viral genome. The CRISPR system won and LUCA survives, only to die later by friendly fire. See, LUCA did not have the ability to recognize PAM. PAM is the protospacer adjacent motif, which is just the adjacent sequence to a spacer sequence within an invader. This sequence would be different from LUCA's adjacent sequence in their genome, and would allow Cas3 to distinguish between self and non-self. So at some point, Cas3 saw a spacer sequence and immediately went in to degrade it, but it was actually the sequence incorporated into LUCA's genome. So Cas3 attacks LUCA, degrading their genome and ultimately killing them. This is called autoimmunity. Thankfully, LUCA already reproduced, and future generations carried on. In my opinion, there are two empires for life on Earth: cells and viruses. We have studied LUCA and built a pretty strong picture of who they were using evidence and groundbreaking research. We've established that LUCA was not alone and had formidable enemies in viruses, which almost certainly predate LUCA. These guys still coexist with us today and plague us in many ways. But we also discovered we could exploit their techniques and methods to intentionally edit and improve our own genomes. So maybe it's not all bad. None of this, however, describes where life itself came from, the origins of life. And that is where our investigation leads us next.